stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about a mysterious woman, a legendary cursed jewel, and a night train from London to the French Riviera, ingredients for the perfect romance or the perfect crime. When the train stops, the jewel is missing, and the woman is found dead in her compartment. It's the perfect mystery, filled with passion, greed, deceit, and confusion. Is Hercule Poirot the perfect detective to solve it? Not always, sir. There was great trouble with one of the Duke of Devise's younger sons. He left Eton under a cloud, and after that he caused great anxiety on several occasions. The police would not accept the view that it was kleptomania. A very clever young gentleman, sir, but vicious through and through, if you take my meaning. His Grace shipped him to Australia, and I hear he was convicted out there under another name. Very odd, sir, but there it is. The young gentleman, I need hardly say, was not in want financially. Poirot nodded his head slowly. Love of excitement, he murmured, and a little kink in the brain somewhere. I wonder now. He drew out the telegram from his pocket and read it again. Then there was Lady Mary Fox's daughter, continued the valet in a mood of reminiscence. Swindled tradespeople something shocking, she did. Very worrying to the best families, if I may say so, and there are many other queer cases I could mention. You have a wide experience, Georges, murmured Poirot. I often wonder, having lived so exclusively with titled families, that you demean yourself by coming as a valet to me. I put it down to love of excitement on your part. Not exactly, sir, said George. I happened to see in society snippets that you had been received at Buckingham Palace. That was just when I was looking for a new situation. His Majesty, so it said, had been most gracious and friendly and thought very highly of your abilities. Ah, said Poirot, one always likes to know the reason for things. He remained in thought for a few moments and then said, You rang up Mademoiselle Popopoulos? Yes, sir, she and her father will be pleased to dine with you tonight. Ah, said Poirot thoughtfully. He drank off his chocolate, set the cup and saucer neatly in the middle of the tray, and spoke gently, more to himself than to the valet. The squirrel, my good Georges, collects nuts. He stores them up in the autumn so that they may be of advantage to him later. To make a success of humanity, Georges, we must profit by the lessons of those below us in the animal kingdom. I have always done so. I have been the cat, watching at the mouse hole. I have been the good dog, following up the scent, and not taking my nose from the trail. And also, my good Georges, I have been the squirrel. I have stored away the little fact here, the little fact there. I go now to my store and I take out one particular nut, a nut that I stored away, let me see, 17 years ago. You follow me, Georges? I should hardly have thought, sir, said George, that nuts would have kept so long as that, though I know one can do wonders with preserving bottles. Poirot looked at him and smiled. Chapter 28, Poirot Plays the Squirrel. Poirot started to keep his dinner appointment with a margin of 3/4 of an hour to spare. He had an object in this. The car took him, not straight to Monte Carlo, but to Lady Tamplin's house at Cap Martin, where he asked for Miss Grey. The ladies were dressing and Poirot was shown into a small salon to wait, and here, after a lapse of 3 or 4 minutes, Lennox Tamplin came to him. Catherine is not quite ready yet, she said. Can I give her a message, or would you rather wait until she comes down? Poirot looked at her thoughtfully. He was a minute or two in replying, as though something of great weight hung upon his decision. Apparently the answer to such a simple question mattered. No, he said at last, no, I do not think it is necessary that I should wait to see Mademoiselle Catherine. I think, perhaps, that it is better that I should not. These things are sometimes difficult. Lennox waited politely, her eyebrows slightly raised. I have a piece of news, continued Poirot. You will, perhaps, tell your friend. M. Kettering was arrested tonight for the murder of his wife. You want me to tell Catherine that? Asked Lennox. She breathed rather hard, as though she had been running. Her face, Poirot thought, looked white and strained, rather noticeably so. "If you please, mademoiselle." "Why?" said Lennox. "Do you think Catherine will be upset? Do you think she cares?" "I don't know, mademoiselle," said Poirot. "See, I admit it frankly. As a rule I know everything, but in this case, I do not. You, perhaps, know better than I do." "Yes," said Lennox, "I know, but I am not going to tell you all the same." She paused for a minute or two, her dark brows drawn together in a frown. "You believe he did it?" she said abruptly. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "The police say so." "Ah," said Lennox, hedging, "are you? So there is something to hedge about." Again she was silent, frowning. Poirot said gently, "You have known Derek Kettering a long time, have you not?" "Off and on ever since I was a kid," said Lennox gruffly. Poirot nodded his head several times without speaking. With one of her brusque movements, Lennox drew forward a chair and sat down on it, her elbows on the table and her face supported by her hands. Sitting thus, she looked directly across the table at Poirot. "What have they got to go on?" she demanded. "Motive, I suppose. Probably came into money at her death." "He came into 2 million. And if she had not died he would have been ruined?" "Yes. But there must have been more than that," persisted Lennox. "He travelled by the same train, I know, but that would not be enough to go on by itself. A cigarette case with the letter K on it, which did not belong to Mrs. Kettering, was found in her carriage, and he was seen by 2 people entering and leaving the compartment just before the train got into Lyons." "What 2 people?" "Your friend Miss Gray was one of them. The other was Mademoiselle Mirelle, the dancer." "And he, Derek, what has he got to say about it?" demanded Lennox sharply. "He denies having entered his wife's compartment at all," said Poirot. "Fool," said Lennox crisply, frowning. "Just before Lyons, you say? Does nobody know when she died?" "The doctor's evidence necessarily cannot be very definite," said Poirot. "They are inclined to think that death was unlikely to have occurred after leaving Lyons. And we know this much, that a few moments after leaving Lyons Mrs. Kettering was dead." "How do you know that?" Poirot was smiling rather oddly to himself. "Someone else went into her compartment and found her dead." "And they did not rouse the train?" "No." "Why was that?" "Doubtless they had their reasons." Lennox looked at him sharply. "Do you know the reason?" "I think so, yes." Lennox sat still, turning things over in her mind. Poirot watched her in silence. At last she looked up. A soft color had come into her cheeks and her eyes were shining. "You think someone on the train must have killed her, but that need not be so at all. What is to stop anyone swinging themselves onto the train when it stopped at Lyons? They could go straight to her compartment, strangle her, and take the rubies and drop off the train again without anyone being the wiser. She may have been actually killed while the train was in Lyons station. Then she would have been alive when Derek went in, and dead when the other person found her." Poirot leant back in his chair. He drew a deep breath. He looked across at the girl and nodded his head 3 times, then he heaved a sigh. "Mademoiselle," he said, "what you have said there is very just, very true. I was struggling in darkness, and you have shown me a light. There was a point that puzzled me and you have made it plain." He got up. "And Derek?" said Lennox. "Who knows?" said Poirot, with a shrug of his shoulders. "But I will tell you this, mademoiselle. I am not satisfied, no, I, Hercule Poirot, am not yet satisfied. It may be that this very night I shall learn something more. At least, I go to try." "You are meeting someone?" "Yes." "Someone who knows something?" "Someone who might know something. In these matters one must leave no stone unturned. Au revoir, mademoiselle." Lennox accompanied him to the door. "Have I helped?" she asked. Poirot's face softened as he looked up at her standing on the doorstep above him. "Yes, mademoiselle, you have helped. If things are very dark, always remember that. When the car had driven off, he relapsed into a frowning absorption, but in his eyes was that faint green light which was always the precursor of the triumph to be. He was a few minutes late at the rendezvous, and found that M. Papopoulos and his daughter had arrived before him. His apologies were abject, and he outdid himself in politeness and small attentions. The Greek was looking particularly benign and noble this evening, a sorrowful patriarch of blameless life. Zia was looking handsome and good-humored. The dinner was a pleasant one. Poirot was his best and most sparkling self. He told anecdotes, he made jokes, he paid graceful compliments to Zia Papopoulos, and he told many interesting incidents of his career. The menu was a carefully selected one, and the wine was excellent. At the close of dinner M. Papopoulos inquired politely, "And the tip I gave you? You have had your little flutter on the horse." "I am in communication with, my bookmaker," replied Poirot. The eyes of the two men met. "A well-known horse, eh?" "No," said Poirot, "it is what our friends, the English, call a dark horse." "Ah," said M. Papopoulos thoughtfully. "Now we must step across to the casino and have our little flutter at the roulette table," cried Poirot gaily. At the casino the party separated, Poirot devoting himself solely to Zia, whilst Papopoulos himself drifted away. Poirot was not fortunate, but Zia had a run of good luck, and had soon won a few thousand francs. "It would be as well," she observed dryly to Poirot, "if I stopped now." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Superb!" he exclaimed. "You are the daughter of your father, Mademoiselle Zia. To know when to stop. Ah! That is the art." He looked round the rooms. "I cannot see your father anywhere about," he remarked carelessly. "I will fetch your cloak for you, mademoiselle, and we will go out in the gardens." He did not, however, go straight to the cloak-room. His sharp eyes had seen but a little while before the departure of M. Papopoulos. He was anxious to know what had become of the wily Greek. He ran him to earth unexpectedly in the big entrance hall. He was standing by one of the pillars, talking to a lady who had just arrived. The lady was Morel. Poirot sidled unostentatiously round the room. He arrived at the other side of the pillar, and unnoticed by the two who were talking together in an animated fashion, or rather, that is to say, the dancer was talking, Papopoulos contributing an occasional monosyllable and a good many expressive gestures. "I tell you I must have time," the dancer was saying. "If you give me time I will get the money." To wait, the Greek shrugged his shoulders, "It is awkward." "Only a very little while," pleaded the other. "Ah. But you must. A week, 10 days, that is all I ask. You can be sure of your affair. The money will be forthcoming." Papopoulos shifted a little and looked round him uneasily to find Poirot almost at his elbow with a beaming innocent face. "Ah. Vous voilà, M. Papopoulos. I have been looking for you. It is permitted that I take Mademoiselle Zia for a little turn in the gardens? Good evening, mademoiselle." He bowed very low to Morel. "1,000 pardons that I did not see you immediately." The dancer accepted his greetings rather impatiently. She was clearly annoyed at the interruption of her tête-à-tête. Poirot was quick to take the hint. Papopoulos had already murmured, "Certainly, but certainly," and Poirot withdrew forthwith. He fetched Zia's cloak, and together they strolled out into the gardens. "This is where the suicides take place," said Zia. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "So it is said. Men are foolish, are they not, mademoiselle? To eat, to drink, to breathe the good air, it is a very pleasant thing, mademoiselle. One is foolish to leave all that simply because one has no money or because the heart aches. L'amour, it causes many fatalities, does it not?" Zia laughed. "You should not laugh at love, mademoiselle," said Poirot, shaking an energetic forefinger at her. "You who are young and beautiful." "Hardly that," said Zia, "you forget that I am 33, M. Poirot. I am frank with you, because it is no good being otherwise. As you told my father, it is exactly 17 years since you aided us in Paris that time. When I look at you, it seems much less, said Poirot gallantly. You were then very much as you are now, mademoiselle, a little thinner, a little paler, a little more serious. 16 years old and fresh from your pension. Not quite the petite pensionnaire, not quite a woman. You were very delicious, very charming, Mademoiselle Zia, others thought so too, without doubt. At 16, said Zia, one is simple and a little fool. That may be, said Poirot, yes, that well may be. At 16 one is credulous, is one not? One believes what one is told. If he saw the quick sideways glance that the girl shot at him, he pretended not to have done so. He continued dreamily, it was a curious affair that, altogether. Your father, mademoiselle, has never understood the true inwardness of it. No? When he asked me for details, for explanations, I said to him thus. Without scandal, I have got back for you that which was lost. You must ask no questions. Do you know, mademoiselle, why I said these things? I have no idea, said the girl coldly. It was because I had a soft spot in my heart for a little pensionnaire, so pale, so thin, so serious. I don't understand what you are talking about, cried Zia angrily. Do you not, mademoiselle? Have you forgotten Antonio Perezio? He heard the quick intake of her breath, almost a gasp. He came to work as an assistant in the shop, but not thus could he have got hold of what he wanted. An assistant can lift his eyes to his master's daughter, can he not? If he is young and handsome with a glib tongue. And since they cannot make love all the time, they must occasionally talk of things that interest them both, such as that very interesting thing which was temporarily in M. Populous possession. And since, as you say, mademoiselle, the young are foolish and credulous, it was easy to believe him and to give him a sight of that particular thing, to show him where it was kept. And afterwards, when it is gone, when the unbelievable catastrophe has happened. Alas! The poor little pensionnaire! What a terrible position she is in! She is frightened, the poor little one. To speak or not to speak? And then there comes along that excellent fellow, Hercule Poirot. Almost a miracle it must have been, the way things arranged themselves. The priceless heirlooms are restored and there are no awkward questions. Zia turned on him fiercely. You have known all the time? Who told you? Was it Antonio? Poirot shook his head. No one told me, he said quietly. I guessed. It was a good guess, was it not, mademoiselle? You see, unless you are good at guessing, it is not much use being a detective. The girl walked along beside him for some minutes in silence. Then she said in a hard voice, Well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to tell my father? No, said Poirot sharply. Certainly not. She looked at him curiously. You want something from me? I want your help, mademoiselle. What makes you think that I can help you? I do not think so. I only hope so. And if I do not help you, then you will tell my father? But no. Debarrass yourself of that idea, mademoiselle. I am not a blackmailer. I do not hold your secret over your head and threaten you with it. If I refuse to help you, began the girl slowly. Then you refuse, and that is that. Then why? She stopped. Listen, and I will tell you why. Women, mademoiselle, are generous. If they can render a service to one who has rendered a service to them, they will do it. I was generous once to you, mademoiselle. When I might have spoken, I held my tongue. There was another silence, then the girl said, My father gave you a hint the other day. It was very kind of him. I do not think, said Zia slowly, that there is anything that I can add to that. If Poirot was disappointed, he did not show it. Not a muscle of his face changed. Eh bien, he said cheerfully, then we must talk of other things. And he proceeded to chat gaily. The girl was distrait, however, and her answers were mechanical and not always to the point. It was when they were approaching the casino once more that she seemed to come to a decision. Poirot? Yes, mademoiselle. I should like to help you if I could. You are very amiable, mademoiselle, very amiable. Again there was a pause. Poirot did not press her. He was quite content to wait and let her take her own time. "Ah bah," said Zia, "after all, why should I not tell you? My father is cautious, always cautious in everything he says. But I know that with you it is not necessary. You have told us it is only the murderer you seek, and that you are not concerned over the jewels. I believe you. You were quite right when you guessed that we were in Nice because of the rubies. They have been handed over here according to plan. My father has them now. He gave you a hint the other day as to who our mysterious client was." "The Marquis?" murmured Poirot softly. "Yes, the Marquis." "Have you ever seen the Marquis, Mademoiselle Zia?" "Once," said the girl. "But not very well," she added. "It was through a keyhole." "That always presents difficulties," said Poirot sympathetically, "but all the same you saw him. You would know him again?" Zia shook her head. "He wore a mask," she explained. "Young or old?" "He had white hair. It may have been a wig, it may not. It fitted very well. But I do not think he was old. His walk was young, and so was his voice." "His voice?" said Poirot thoughtfully. "Ah, his voice. Would you know it again, Mademoiselle Zia?" "I might," said the girl. "You were interested in him, eh? It was that took you to the keyhole." Zia nodded. "Yes, yes. I was curious. One had heard so much he is not the ordinary thief, he is more like a figure of history or romance." "Yes," said Poirot thoughtfully, "yes, perhaps so. But it is not this that I meant to tell you," said Zia. "It was just one other little fact that I thought might be well useful to you." "Yes?" said Poirot encouragingly. "The rubies, as I say, were handed over to my father here at Nice. I did not see the person who handed them over, but—" "Yes? I know one thing. It was a woman." Chapter 29. A letter from home. Dear Catherine, living among grand friends as you are doing now, I don't suppose you will care to hear any of our news, but as I always thought you were a sensible girl, perhaps you are a trifle less swollen-headed than I suppose. Everything goes on much the same here. There was great trouble about the new curate, who is scandalously high. In my view, he is neither more nor less than a Roman. Everybody has spoken to the vicar about it, but you know what the vicar is, all Christian charity and no proper spirit. I have had a lot of trouble with maids lately. That girl Annie was no good, skirts up to her knees and wouldn't wear sensible woolen stockings. Not one of them can bear being spoken to. I have had a lot of pain with my rheumatism one way and another, and Dr. Harris persuaded me to go and see a London specialist, a waste of 3 guineas and a railway fare, as I told him, but by waiting until Wednesday I managed to get a cheap return. The London doctor pulled a long face and talked all round about and never straight out, until I said to him, "I'm a plain woman, doctor, and I like things to be plainly stated. Is it cancer, or is it not?" And then, of course, he had to say it was. They say a year with care, and not too much pain, though I am sure I can bear pain as well as any other Christian woman. Life seems rather lonely at times, with most of my friends dead or gone before. I wish you were in Street Mary Mead, my dear, and that is a fact. If you hadn't come into this money and gone off into grand society, I would have offered you double the salary poor Jane gave you to come and look after me, but there's no good wanting what we can't get. However, if things should go ill with you, and that is always possible. I have heard no end of tales of bogus noblemen marrying girls and getting hold of their money and then leaving them at the church door. I dare say you are too sensible for anything of the kind to happen to you, but one never knows, and never having had much attention of any kind it might easily go to your head now. So just in case, my dear, remember there is always a home for you here, and though a plain-spoken woman I am a warm-hearted one too. Your affectionate old friend, Amelia Viner. P.S. I saw a mention of you in the paper with your cousin, Viscountess Tamplin, and I cut it out and put it with my cuttings. I prayed for you on Sunday that you might be kept from pride and vainglory. Catherine read this characteristic epistle through twice, then she laid it down and stared out of her bedroom window across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. She felt a curious lump in her throat. A sudden wave of longing for Street Mary Mead swept over her. So full of familiar, everyday, stupid little things, and yet, home. She felt very inclined to lay her head down on her arms and indulge in a real good cry. Lennox, coming in at the moment, saved her. "Hello, Catherine," said Lennox. "I say, what is the matter?" "Nothing," said Catherine, grabbing up Miss Viner's letter and thrusting it into her handbag. "You looked rather queer," said Lennox. "I say, I hope you don't mind. I rang up your detective friend, M. Poirot, and asked him to lunch with us in Nice. I said you wanted to see him, as I thought he might not come for me." "Did you want to see him then?" asked Catherine. "Yes," said Lennox. "I have rather lost my heart to him. I never met a man before whose eyes were really green like a cat's." "All right," said Catherine. She spoke listlessly. The last few days had been trying. Derek Kettering's arrest had been the topic of the hour, and the Blue Train mystery had been thrashed out from every conceivable standpoint. "I have ordered the car," said Lennox, "and I have told Mother some lie or other. Unfortunately, I can't remember exactly what, but it won't matter, as she never remembers. If she knew where we were going, she would want to come too, to pump M. Poirot." The two girls arrived at the Negresco to find Poirot waiting. He was full of Gallic politeness, and showered so many compliments upon the two girls that they were soon helpless with laughter, yet for all that the meal was not a gay one. Catherine was dreamy and distracted, and Lennox made bursts of conversation, interspersed by silences. As they were sitting on the terrace sipping their coffee, she suddenly attacked Poirot bluntly. "How are things going? You know what I mean?" Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "They take their course," he said. "And you are just letting them take their course?" He looked at Lennox a little sadly. "You are young, mademoiselle, but there are three things that cannot be hurried: le bon Dieu, nature, and old people." "Nonsense," said Lennox. "You are not old." "Ah, it is pretty what you say there." "Here is Major Knighton," said Lennox. Catherine looked round quickly and then turned back again. "He is with Mr. Van Alden," continued Lennox. "There is something I want to ask Major Knighton about. I won't be a minute." Left alone together, Poirot bent forward and murmured to Catherine. "You are distrait, mademoiselle. Your thoughts, they are far away, are they not?" "Just as far as England, no farther." Guided by a sudden impulse, she took the letter she had received that morning and handed it across to him to read. "That is the first word that has come to me from my old life. Somehow or other it hurts." He read it through and then handed it back to her. "So you are going back to Street Mary Mead?" he said slowly. "No, I am not," said Catherine. "Why should I?" "Ah," said Poirot, "it is my mistake. You will excuse me one little minute." He strolled across to where Lennox Tamplin was talking to Van Alden and Knighton. The American looked old and haggard. He greeted Poirot with a curt nod but without any other sign of animation. As he turned to reply to some observation made by Lennox, Poirot drew Knighton aside. "M. Van Alden looks ill," he said. "Do you wonder?" asked Knighton. "The scandal of Derek Kettering's arrest has about put the lid on things, as far as he is concerned. He is even regretting that he asked you to find out the truth." "He should go back to England," said Poirot. "We are going the day after tomorrow." "That is good news," said Poirot. He hesitated, and looked across the terrace to where Catherine was sitting. "I wish," he murmured, "that you could tell Miss Grey that." "Tell her what?" "That I mean that M. Van Alden is returning to England." Knighton looked a little puzzled, but he readily crossed the terrace and joined Catherine. Poirot saw him go with a satisfied nod of the head, and then joined Lennox and the American. After a minute or two they joined the others. Conversation was general for a few minutes, then the millionaire and his secretary departed. Poirot also prepared to take his departure. "1,000 thanks for your hospitality, mademoiselle," he cried, "it has been a most charming luncheon. Ma foi, I needed it." He swelled out his chest and thumped it. "I am now a lion, a giant. Ah, Mademoiselle Catherine, you have not seen me as I can be. You have seen the gentle, the calm Hercule Poirot, but there is another Hercule Poirot. I go now to bully, to threaten, to strike terror into the hearts of those who listen to me." He looked at them in a self-satisfied way, and they both appeared to be duly impressed, though Lennox was biting her under lip, and the corners of Catherine's mouth had a suspicious twitch. "And I shall do it," he said gravely. "Oh yes, I shall succeed." He had gone but a few steps when Catherine's voice made him turn. Poirot, I want to tell you. I think you were right in what you said. I am going back to England almost immediately." Poirot stared at her very hard, and under the directness of his scrutiny she blushed. "I see," he said gravely. "I don't believe you do," said Catherine. "I know more than you think, mademoiselle," he said quietly. He left her, with an odd little smile upon his lips. Entering a waiting car, he drove to Antibes. Hippolyte, the Comte de la Roche's wooden-faced manservant, was busy at the Villa Marina polishing his master's beautiful cut table glass. The Comte de la Roche himself had gone to Monte Carlo for the day. Chancing to look out of the window, Hippolyte espied a visitor walking briskly up to the hall door, a visitor of so uncommon a type that Hippolyte, experienced as he was, had some difficulty in placing him. Calling to his wife, Marie, who was busy in the kitchen, he drew her attention to what he called C-type la. "It is not the police again?" said Marie anxiously. "Look for yourself," said Hippolyte. Marie looked. "Certainly not the police," she declared. "I am glad." "They have not really worried us much," said Hippolyte. "In fact, but for Monsieur le Comte's warning, I should never have guessed that stranger at the wine shop to be what he was." The hall bell pealed and Hippolyte, in a grave and decorous manner, went to open the door. Le Comte, I regret to say, is not at home." The little man with the large moustaches beamed placidly. "I know that," he replied. "You are Hippolyte Flavel, are you not?" "Yes, monsieur, that is my name." "And you have a wife, Marie Flavel?" "Yes, monsieur, but—" "I desire to see you both," said the stranger, and he stepped nimbly past Hippolyte into the hall. "Your wife is doubtless in the kitchen," he said. "I will go there." Before Hippolyte could recover his breath, the other had selected the right door at the back of the hall and passed along the passage and into the kitchen, where Marie paused open-mouthed to stare at him. "Voilà," said the stranger, and sank into a wooden armchair. "I am Hercule Poirot." "Yes, monsieur." "You do not know the name?" "I have never heard it," said Hippolyte. "Permit me to say that you have been badly educated. It is the name of one of the great ones of this world." He sighed and folded his hands across his chest. Hippolyte and Marie were staring at him uneasily. They were at a loss what to make of this unexpected and extremely strange visitor. "Monsieur desires," murmured Hippolyte mechanically. "I desire to know why you have lied to the police." "Monsieur!" cried Hippolyte, "I lied to the police? Never have I done such a thing." Poirot shook his head. "You are wrong," he said, "you have done it on several occasions. Let me see." He took a small notebook from his pocket and consulted it. "Ah, yes, on 7 occasions at least. I will recite them to you." In a gentle unemotional voice he proceeded to outline the 7 occasions. Hippolyte was taken aback. "But it is not of these past lapses that I wish to speak," continued Poirot, "only, my dear friend, do not get into the habit of thinking yourself too clever. I come now to the particular lie in which I am concerned, your statement that the Comte de la Roche arrived at this villa on the morning of 14th January. But that was no lie, monsieur, that was the truth. Monsieur le Comte arrived here on the morning of Tuesday, the 14th. That is so, Marie, is it not?" Marie assented eagerly. "Ah, yes, that is quite right. I remember it perfectly." "Ah," said Poirot, And what did you give your good master for déjeuner that day? Marie paused, trying to collect herself. Odd, said Poirot, how one remembers some things and forgets others. He leant forward and struck the table a blow with his fist, his eyes flashed with anger. Yes, it is as I say. You tell your lies and you think nobody knows. But there are two people who know. Yes, two people. One is le bon Dieu. He raised a hand to heaven, and then settling himself back in his chair and shutting his eyelids, he murmured comfortably. And the other is Hercule Poirot. I assure you, monsieur, you are completely mistaken. Monsieur le Comte left Paris on Monday night. True, said Poirot by the rapide. I do not know where he broke his journey. Perhaps you do not know that. What I do know is that he arrived here on Wednesday morning, and not on Tuesday morning. Monsieur is mistaken, said Marie stolidly. Poirot rose to his feet. Then the law must take its course, he murmured. A pity. What do you mean, monsieur? Asked Marie, with a shade of uneasiness. You will be arrested and held as accomplices concerned in the murder of Mrs. Kettering, the English lady who was killed. Murder. The man's face had gone chalk white, his knees knocked together. Marie dropped the rolling pin and began to weep. But it is impossible, impossible. I thought. Since you stick to your story, there is nothing to be said. I think you are both foolish. He was turning towards the door when an agitated voice arrested him. Monsieur, just a little moment. I had no idea that it was anything of this kind. I thought it was just a matter concerning a lady. There have been little awkwardnesses with the police over ladies before. But murder, that is very different. I have no patience with you, cried Poirot. He turned round on them and angrily shook his fist in Hippolyta's face. Am I to stop here all day, arguing with a couple of imbeciles thus? It is the truth I want. If you will not give it to me, that is your lookout. For the last time, when did Monsieur le Comte arrive at the Villa Marina, Tuesday morning or Wednesday morning? Wednesday, gasped the man, and behind him Marie nodded confirmation. Poirot regarded them for a minute or two, then inclined his head gravely. You are wise, my children, he said quietly. Very nearly you were in serious trouble. He left the Villa Marina, smiling to himself. One guess, confirmed, he murmured to himself. Shall I take a chance on the other? It was 6 o'clock when the card of Monsieur Hercule Poirot was brought up to Mirelle. She stared at it for a moment or two, and then nodded. When Poirot entered, he found her walking up and down the room feverishly. She turned on him furiously. Well, she cried. Well, what is it now? Have you not tortured me enough, all of you? Have you not made me betray my poor Diric? What more do you want? Just one little question, mademoiselle. After the train left Lyons, when you entered Mrs. Kettering's compartment. What is that? Poirot looked at her with an air of mild reproach and began again. I say, when you entered Mrs. Kettering's compartment. I never did. And found her. I never did. Ah, sacré. He turned on her in a rage and shouted at her, so that she cowered back before him. Will you lie to me? I tell you I know what happened as well as though I had been there. You went into her compartment and you found her dead. I tell you I know it. To lie to me is dangerous. Be careful, Mademoiselle Mirelle. Her eyes wavered beneath his gaze and fell. I didn't, she began uncertainly and stopped. There is only one thing about which I wonder, said Poirot. I wonder, mademoiselle, if you found what you were looking for or whether. Whether what? Or whether someone else had been before you. I will answer no more questions, screamed the dancer. She tore herself away from Poirot's restraining hand, and flinging herself down on the floor in a frenzy, she screamed and sobbed. A frightened maid came rushing in. Hercule Poirot shrugged his shoulders, raised his eyebrows, and quietly left the room. But he seemed satisfied. Chapter 30. Miss Viner gives judgment. Catherine looked out of Miss Viner's bedroom window. It was raining, Not violently, but with a quiet, well-bred persistence. The window looked out on a strip of front garden with a path down to the gate and neat little flower beds on either side, where later roses and pinks and blue hyacinths would bloom. Miss Viner was lying in a large Victorian bedstead. A tray with the remains of breakfast had been pushed to one side and she was busy opening her correspondence and making various caustic comments upon it. Catherine had an open letter in her hand and was reading it through for the second time. It was dated from the Ritz Hotel, Paris. Chère Mademoiselle Catherine, it began. I trust that you are in good health and that the return to the English winter has not proved too depressing. I prosecute my inquiries with the utmost diligence. Do not think that it is the holiday that I take here. Very shortly I shall be in England, and I hope then to have the pleasure of meeting you once more. It shall be so, shall it not? On arrival in London I shall write to you. You remember that we are the colleagues in this affair? But indeed I think you know that very well. Be assured, Mademoiselle, of my most respectful and devoted sentiments. Hercule Poirot. Catherine frowned slightly. It was as though something in the letter puzzled and intrigued her. A choir boys' picnic indeed, came from Miss Viner. Tommy Saunders and Albert Dykes ought to be left behind, and I shan't subscribe to it unless they are. What those two boys think they are doing in church on Sundays I don't know. Tommy sang, "Oh God, make speed to save us," and never opened his lips again, and if Albert Dykes wasn't sucking a mint humbug, my nose is not what it is and always has been. I know, they are awful, agreed Catherine. She opened her second letter, and a sudden flush came to her cheeks. Miss Viner's voice in the room seemed to recede into the far distance. When she came back to a sense of her surroundings, Miss Viner was bringing a long speech to a triumphant termination. And I said to her, "Not at all. As it happens, Miss Grey is Lady Tamplin's own cousin. What do you think of that? Were you fighting my battles for me? That was very sweet of you. You can put it that way if you like. There is nothing to me in a title. Vicar's wife or no vicar's wife, that woman is a cat. Hinting you had bought your way into society. Perhaps she was not so very far wrong. And look at you," continued Miss Viner. "Have you come back a stuck-up fine lady, as well you might have done? No, there you are, as sensible as ever you were, with a pair of good Balbriggan stockings on and sensible shoes. I spoke to Ellen about it only yesterday. 'Ellen,' I said, 'you look at Miss Grey. She has been hobnobbing with some of the greatest in the land, and does she go about as you do with skirts up to her knees and silk stockings that ladder when you look at them, and the most ridiculous shoes that ever I set eyes on?'" Catherine smiled a little to herself. It had apparently been worth while to conform to Miss Viner's prejudices. The old lady went on with increasing gusto. "It has been a great relief to me that you have not had your head turned. Only the other day I was looking for my cuttings. I have several about Lady Tamplin and her war hospital and what not, but I cannot lay my hand upon them. I wish you would look, my dear, your eyesight is better than mine. They are all in a box in the bureau drawer." Catherine glanced down at the letter in her hand and was about to speak, but checked herself, and going over to the bureau found the box of cuttings and began to look over them. Since her return to Street Mary Mead her heart had gone out to Miss Viner in admiration of the old woman's stoicism and pluck. She felt that there was little she could do for her old friend, but she knew from experience how much those seemingly small trifles meant to old people. "Here is one," she said presently. "Viscountess Tamplin, who is running her villa at Nice as an officers' hospital, has just been the victim of a sensational robbery, her jewels having been stolen. Amongst them were some very famous emeralds, heirlooms of the Tamplin family." "Probably paste," said Miss Viner, "a lot of these society women's jewels are." "Here is another," said Catherine. "A picture of her, a charming camera study of Viscountess Tamplin with her little daughter Lennox." "Let me look," said Miss Viner. "You can't see much of the child's face, can you? But I dare say that is just as well. Things go by contraries in this world and beautiful mothers have hideous children. I dare say the photographer realized that to take the back of the child's head was the best thing he could do for her." Catherine laughed. One of the smartest hostesses on the Riviera this season is Viscountess Tamplin, who has a villa at Cap Martin. Her cousin, Miss Grey, who recently inherited a vast fortune in a most romantic manner, is staying with her there. "That is the one I wanted," said Miss Viner. "I expect there's been a picture of you in one of the papers that I have missed, you know the kind of thing. Mrs. Somebody or other Jones Williams, at the something or other point to point, usually carrying a shooting stick and having one foot lifted up in the air. It must be a trial to some of them to see what they look like." Catherine did not answer. She was smoothing out the cutting with her finger, and her face had a puzzled, worried look. Then she drew the second letter out of its envelope and mastered its contents once more. She turned to her friend. "Miss Viner? I wonder there is a friend of mine, someone I met on the Riviera, who wants very much to come down and see me here?" "A man," said Miss Viner. "Yes." "Who is he?" "He is secretary to Mr. Van Alden, the American millionaire." "What is his name?" "Knighton. Major Knighton." Secretary to a millionaire. And wants to come down here. Now, Catherine, I am going to say something to you for your own good. You are a nice girl and a sensible girl, and though you have your head screwed on the right way about most things, every woman makes a fool of herself once in her life. 10 to 1 what this man is after is your money. With a gesture she arrested Catherine's reply. "I have been waiting for something of this kind. What is a secretary to a millionaire? 9 times out of 10 it is a young man who likes living soft. A young man with nice manners and a taste for luxury and no brains and no enterprise, and if there is anything that is a softer job than being a secretary to a millionaire, it is marrying a rich woman for her money. I am not saying that you might not be some man's fancy, but you are not young, and though you have a very good complexion you are not a beauty, and what I say to you is, don't make a fool of yourself, but if you are determined to do so, do see that your money is properly tied up on yourself. There, now I have finished. What have you got to say?" "Nothing," said Catherine, "but would you mind if he did come to see me?" "I wash my hands of it," said Miss Viner. "I have done my duty, and whatever happens now is on your own head. Would you like him to lunch or to dinner? I dare say Ellen could manage dinner, that is, if she didn't lose her head." "Lunch would be very nice," said Catherine. "It is awfully kind of you, Miss Viner. He asked me to ring him up, so I will do so and say that we shall be pleased if he will lunch with us. He will motor down from town." "Ellen does a steak with grilled tomatoes pretty fairly," said Miss Viner. "She doesn't do it well, but she does it better than anything else. It is no good having a tart because she is heavy-handed with pastry, but her little castle puddings are not bad, and I dare say you could find a nice piece of Stilton at Abbott's. I have always heard that gentlemen like a nice piece of Stilton, and there is a good deal of father's wine left, a bottle of sparkling Moselle, perhaps." "Oh, no, Miss Viner, that is really not necessary." "Nonsense, my child. No gentleman is happy unless he drinks something with his meal. There is some good pre-war whiskey if you think he would prefer that. Now do as I say and don't argue. The key of the wine cellar is in the 3rd drawer down in the dressing table, in the 2nd pair of stockings on the left-hand side." Catherine went obediently to the spot indicated. "The 2nd pair, now mind," said Miss Viner. "The 1st pair has my diamond earrings and my filigree brooch in it." "Oh," said Catherine, rather taken aback, "wouldn't you like them put in your jewel case?" Miss Viner gave vent to a terrific and prolonged snort. "No, indeed. I have much too much sense for that sort of thing, thank you. Dear, dear, I well remember how my poor father had a safe built in downstairs. Pleased as punch he was with it, and he said to my mother, 'Now, Mary, you bring me your jewels in their case every night and I will lock them away for you.' My mother was a very tactful woman, and she knew that gentlemen like having their own way, and she brought him the jewel case locked up just as he said. And one night burglars broke in, and of course naturally the first thing they went for was the safe. It would be, with my father talking up and down the village and bragging about it until you might have thought he kept all King Solomon's diamonds there. They made a clean sweep, got the tankards, the silver cups, and the presentation gold plate that my father had presented to him, and the jewel case. She sighed reminiscently. My father was in a great state over my mother's jewels. There was the Venetian set and some very fine cameos and some pale pink corals, and 2 diamond rings with quite large stones in them. And then, of course, she had to tell him that, being a sensible woman, she had kept her jewelry rolled up in a pair of corsets, and there it was still as safe as anything. And the jewel case had been quite empty? Oh no, dear, said Miss Viner, it would have been too light a weight then. My mother was a very intelligent woman, she saw to that. She kept her buttons in the jewel case, and a very handy place it was. Boot buttons in the top tray, trouser buttons in the second tray, and assorted buttons below. Curiously enough, my father was quite annoyed with her. He said he didn't like deceit. But I mustn't go chattering on, you want to go and ring up your friend, and mind you choose a nice piece of steak, and tell Ellen she is not to have holes in her stockings when she waits at lunch. Is her name Ellen or Helen, Miss Viner? I thought. Miss Viner closed her eyes. I can sound my H's, dear, as well as anyone, but Helen is not a suitable name for a servant. I don't know what the mothers in the lower classes are coming to nowadays. The rain had cleared away when Knighton arrived at the cottage. The pale fitful sunshine shone down on it and burnished Catherine's head as she stood in the doorway to welcome him. He came up to her quickly, almost boyishly. I say, I hope you don't mind. I simply had to see you again soon. I hope the friend you are staying with does not mind. Come in and make friends with her, said Catherine. She can be most alarming, but you will soon find that she has the softest heart in the world. Miss Viner was enthroned majestically in the drawing-room, wearing a complete set of the cameos which had been so providentially preserved in the family. She greeted Knighton with dignity and an austere politeness which would have damped many men. Knighton, however, had a charm of manner which was not easily set aside, and after about 10 minutes Miss Viner thawed perceptibly. Luncheon was a merry meal, and Ellen, or Helen, in a new pair of silk stockings devoid of ladders performed prodigies of waiting. Afterwards, Catherine and Knighton went for a walk and they came back to have tea tête-à-tête, since Miss Viner had gone to lie down. When the car had finally driven off, Catherine went slowly upstairs. A voice called her and she went into Miss Viner's bedroom. Friend gone? Yes. Thank you so much for letting me ask him down. No need to thank me. Do you think I am the sort of old curmudgeon who never will do anything for anybody? I think you are a dear, said Catherine affectionately. Humph, said Miss Viner mollified. As Catherine was leaving the room she called her back. Catherine? Yes. I was wrong about that young man of yours. A man when he is making up to anybody can be cordial and gallant and full of little attentions and altogether charming. But when a man is really in love he can't help looking like a sheep. Now, whenever that young man looked at you he looked like a sheep. I take back all I said this morning. It is genuine. Chapter 31 Mr. Aaron's Lunches. Ah, said Mr. Joseph Aarons, appreciatively. He took a long draught from his tankard, set it down with a sigh, wiped the froth from his lips, and beamed across the table at his host, Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Give me, said Mr. Aarons, a good porterhouse steak and a tankard of something worth drinking, and anyone can have your French fowls and whatnots, your hors d'oeuvres and your omelettes and your little bits of quail. Give me, he reiterated, a porterhouse steak. Poirot, who had just complied with this request, smiled sympathetically. Not that there is much wrong with a steak and kidney pudding, continued Mr. Aarons. Apple tart? Yes, I will take apple tart, thank you, miss, and a jug of cream. The meal proceeded. Finally, with a long sigh, Mr. Aarons laid down his spoon and fork preparatory to toying with some cheese before turning his mind to other matters. There was a little matter of business I think you said, Monsieur Poirot, he remarked. Anything I can do to help you I am sure I shall be most happy. That is very kind of you, said Poirot. I said to myself, if you want to know anything about the dramatic profession there is one person who knows all that is to be known and that is my old friend, Mr. Joseph Aarons. And you don't say far wrong, said Mr. Aarons complacently, whether it is past, present, or future, Joe Aarons is the man to come to. Precisement. Now I want to ask you, Monsieur Aarons, what you know about a young woman called Kid. Kid? Kitty Kid? Kitty Kid. Pretty smart, she was. Male impersonator, song and a dance, that one? That is the one. Very smart, she was. Made a good income. Never out of an engagement. Male impersonation mostly, but, as a matter of fact, you could not touch her as a character actress. So I have heard, said Poirot, but she has not been appearing lately, has she? No. Dropped right out of things. Went over to France and took up with some swell nobleman there. She quitted the stage then for good and all, I guess. How long ago was that? Let me see. 3 years ago. And she has been a loss, let me tell you that. She was clever? Clever as a cartload of monkeys. You don't know the name of the man she became friends with in Paris? He was a swell, I know that. A count, or was it a marquis? Now I come to think of it, I believe it was a marquis. And you know nothing about her since? Nothing. Never even run across her accidentally like. I bet she is tooling it round some of these foreign resorts. Being a marquise to the life. You couldn't put one over on Kitty. She would give as good as she got any day. I see, said Poirot thoughtfully. I am sorry I can't tell you more, Monsieur Poirot, said the other. I would like to be of use to you if I could. You did me a good turn once. Ah, but we are quits on that. You, too, did me a good turn. One good turn deserves another. Ha, ha, said Mr. Aarons. Your profession must be a very interesting one, said Poirot. So, said Mr. Aarons noncommittally. Taking the rough with the smooth, it is all right. I don't do so badly at it, all things considered, but you have to keep your eyes skinned. Never know what the public will jump for next. Dancing has come very much to the fore in the last few years, murmured Poirot reflectively. I never saw anything in this Russian ballet, but people like it. Too highbrow for me. I met one dancer out on the Riviera, Mademoiselle Mirelle. Mirelle? She is hot stuff, by all accounts. There is always money going to back her though, so far as that goes, the girl can dance, I have seen her, and I know what I am talking about. I never had much to do with her myself, but I hear she is a terror to deal with. Tempers and tantrums all the time. Yes, said Poirot thoughtfully, yes, so I should imagine. Temperament, said Mr. Aarons, temperament. That is what they call it themselves. My missus was a dancer before she married me, but I am thankful to say she never had any temperament. You don't want temperament in the home, Monsieur Poirot. I agree with you, my friend, it is out of place there. A woman should be calm and sympathetic, and a good cook, said Mr. Aarons. Mirelle has not been long before the public, has she? Asked Poirot. About 2.5 years, that is all, said Mr. Aarons. Some French duke started her. I hear now that she has taken up with the ex-Prime Minister of Greece. These are the chaps who managed to put money away quietly. That is news to me, said Poirot. Oh, she's not one to let the grass grow under her feet. They say that young Kettering murdered his wife on her account. I don't know, I am sure. Anyway, he is in prison, and she had to look round for herself, and pretty smart she has been about it. They say she is wearing a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. Not that I have ever seen a pigeon's egg myself, but that is what they always call it in works of fiction. A ruby the size of a pigeon's egg, said Poirot. His eyes were green and cat-like. How interesting. I had it from a friend of mine, said Mr. Aarons. But, for all I know, it may be colored glass. They are all the same, these women. They never stop telling tall stories about their jewels. Mirelle goes about bragging that it has got a curse on it. Heart of fire, I think she calls it. But if I remember rightly, said Poirot, the ruby that is named Heart of Fire is the center stone in a necklace. There you are. Didn't I tell you there is no end to the lies women will tell about their jewelry? This is a single stone, hung on a platinum chain round her neck, but, as I said before, 10 to 1 it is a bit of coloured glass. No, said Poirot gently, no, somehow I do not think it is coloured glass. Chapter 32 Catherine and Poirot compare notes. You have changed, mademoiselle, said Poirot suddenly. He and Catherine were seated opposite each other at a small table at the Savoy. Yes, you have changed, he continued. In what way? Mademoiselle, these nuances are difficult to express. I am older. Yes, you are older. And by that I do not mean that the wrinkles and the crow's feet are coming. When I first saw you, mademoiselle, you were a looker-on at life. You had the quiet, amused look of one who sits back in the stalls and watches the play. And now? Now, you no longer watch. It is an absurd thing, perhaps, that I say here, but you have the wary look of a fighter who is playing a difficult game. My old lady is difficult sometimes, said Catherine, with a smile, but I can assure you that I don't engage in deadly contests with her. You must go down and see her some day, Monsieur Poirot. I think you are one of the people who would appreciate her pluck and her spirit. There was a silence while the waiter deftly served them with chicken en casserole. When he had departed, Poirot said, You have heard me speak of my friend Hastings? He who said that I was a human oyster. Eh bien, mademoiselle, I have met my match in you. You, far more than I, play a lone hand. Nonsense, said Catherine lightly. Never does Hercule Poirot talk nonsense. It is as I say. Again there was a silence. Poirot broke it by inquiring. Have you seen any of our Riviera friends since you have been back, mademoiselle? I have seen something of Major Knighton. Aha! Is that so? Something in Poirot's twinkling eyes made Catherine lower hers. So Mr. Van Alden remains in London? Yes. I must try to see him tomorrow or the next day. You have news for him? What makes you think that? I wondered, that is all. Poirot looked across at her with twinkling eyes. And now, mademoiselle, there is much that you wish to ask me, I can see that. And why not? Is not the affair of the blue train our own Roman policier? Yes, there are things I should like to ask you. Eh bien? Catherine looked up with a sudden air of resolution. What were you doing in Paris, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot smiled slightly. I made a call at the Russian embassy. Oh. I see that tells you nothing. But I will not be a human oyster. No, I will lay my cards on the table, which is assuredly a thing that oysters do not do. You suspect, do you not, that I am not satisfied with the case against Derek Kettering? That is what I have been wondering. I thought, in Nice, that you had finished with the case. You do not say all that you mean, mademoiselle. But I admit everything. It was my researches which placed Derek Kettering where he is now. But for me the examining magistrate would still be vainly trying to fasten the crime on the Comte de la Roche. Eh bien, mademoiselle, what I have done I do not regret. I have only one duty to discover the truth, and that way led straight to Mr. Kettering. But did it end there? The police say yes, but I, Hercule Poirot, am not satisfied. He broke off suddenly. Tell me, mademoiselle, have you heard from Mademoiselle Lennox lately? One very short, scrappy letter. She is, I think, annoyed with me for coming back to England. Poirot nodded. I had an interview with her the night that Monsieur Kettering was arrested. It was an interesting interview in more ways than one. Again he fell silent, and Catherine did not interrupt his train of thought. Mademoiselle, he said at last, I am now on delicate ground, yet I will say this to you. There is, I think, someone who loves Monsieur Kettering. Correct me if I am wrong, and for her sake, well, for her sake I hope that I am right and the police are wrong. You know who that someone is? There was a pause, then Catherine said. Yes, I think I know. Poirot leant across the table towards her. I am not satisfied, mademoiselle, no, I am not satisfied. The facts, The main facts led straight to Monsieur Kettering. But there is one thing that has been left out of account. And what is that? The disfigured face of the victim. I have asked myself, Mademoiselle, 100 times, was Derek Kettering the kind of man who would deal that smashing blow after having committed the murder? What end would it serve? What purpose would it accomplish? Was it a likely action for one of Monsieur Kettering's temperament? And, Mademoiselle, the answer to these questions is profoundly unsatisfactory. Again and again I go back to that one point why, and the only things I have to help me to a solution of the problem are these. He whipped out his pocketbook and extracted something from it which he held between his finger and thumb. Do you remember, Mademoiselle? You saw me take these hairs from the rug in the railway carriage. Catherine leant forward, scrutinizing the hairs keenly. Poirot nodded his head slowly several times. They suggest nothing to you, I see that, Mademoiselle. And yet I think somehow that you see a good deal. I have had ideas, said Catherine slowly, curious ideas. That is why I ask you what you were doing in Paris, Monsieur Poirot, when I wrote to you. From the Ritz? A curious smile came over Poirot's face. Yes, as you say, from the Ritz. I am a luxurious person sometimes when a millionaire pays. The Russian embassy, said Catherine, frowning. No, I don't see where that comes in. It does not come in directly, Mademoiselle. I went there to get certain information. I saw a particular personage and I threatened him. Yes, Mademoiselle, I, Hercule Poirot, threatened him. With the police? No, said Poirot dryly, with the press a much more deadly weapon. He looked at Catherine and she smiled at him, just shaking her head. Are you not just turning back into an oyster again, Monsieur Poirot? No, no. I do not wish to make mysteries. See, I will tell you everything. I suspect this man of being the active party in the sale of the jewels of Monsieur Van Alden. I tax him with it, and in the end I get the whole story out of him. I learn where the jewels were handed over, and I learn, too, of the man who paced up and down outside in the street, a man with a venerable head of white hair, but who walked with the light, springy step of a young man, and I give that man a name in my own mind, the name of Monsieur le Marquis. And now you have come to London to see Mr. Van Alden? Not entirely for that reason. I had other work to do. Since I have been in London I have seen 2 more people, a theatrical agent and a Harley Street doctor. From each of them I have got certain information. Put these things together, Mademoiselle, and see if you can make of them the same as I do. I? Yes, you. I will tell you one thing, Mademoiselle. There has been a doubt all along in my mind as to whether the robbery and the murder were done by the same person. For a long time I was not sure. And now? And now I know. There was a silence. Then Catherine lifted her head. Her eyes were shining. I am not clever like you, Monsieur Poirot. Half the things that you have been telling me don't seem to me to point anywhere at all. The ideas that came to me came from such an entirely different angle. Ah, but that is always so, said Poirot quietly. A mirror shows the truth, but everyone stands in a different place for looking into the mirror. My ideas may be absurd, they may be entirely different from yours, but... Yes? Tell me, does this help you at all? He took a newspaper cutting from her outstretched hand. He read it and, looking up, he nodded gravely. As I told you, Mademoiselle, one stands at a different angle for looking into the mirror, but it is the same mirror and the same things are reflected there. Catherine got up. I must rush, she said. I have only just time to catch my train. Monsieur Poirot. Yes, Mademoiselle. It mustn't be much longer, you understand. I can't go on much longer. There was a break in her voice. He patted her hand reassuringly. Courage, Mademoiselle, you must not fail now, the end is very near. Chapter 33 A New Theory. Monsieur Poirot wants to see you, sir. Damn the fellow, said Van Alden. Knighton remained sympathetically silent. Van Alden got up from his chair and paced up and down. I suppose you have seen the cursed newspapers this morning? I have glanced at them, sir. Still at it hammer and tongs. I am afraid so, sir. The millionaire sat down again and pressed his hand to his forehead. If I had had an idea of this, he groaned. I wish to God I had never got that little Belgian to ferret out the truth. Find Ruth's murderer, that was all I thought about. You wouldn't have liked your son-in-law to go scot-free? Van Alden sighed. I would have preferred to take the law into my own hands. I don't think that would have been a very wise proceeding, sir. All the same, are you sure the fellow wants to see me? Yes, Mr. Van Alden. He is very urgent about it. Then I suppose he will have to. He can come along this morning if he likes. It was a very fresh and debonair Poirot who was ushered in. He did not seem to see any lack of cordiality in the millionaire's manner, and chatted pleasantly about various trifles. He was in London, he explained, to see his doctor. He mentioned the name of an eminent surgeon. No, par la guerre, memory of my days in the police force, a bullet of a rascally Apache. He touched his left shoulder and winced realistically. I always consider you a lucky man, Monsieur Van Alden. You are not like our popular idea of American millionaires, martyrs to the dyspepsia. I am pretty tough, said Van Alden. I lead a very simple life, you know, plain fare and not too much of it. You have seen something of Miss Grey, have you not? Inquired Poirot, innocently turning to the secretary. Yes, once or twice, said Knighton. He blushed slightly and Van Alden exclaimed in surprise. Funny you never mentioned to me that you had seen her, Knighton. I didn't think you would be interested, sir. I like that girl very much, said Van Alden. It is 1,000 pities that she should have buried herself once more in Street Mary Mead, said Poirot. It is very fine of her, said Knighton hotly. There are very few people who would bury themselves down there to look after a cantankerous old woman who has no earthly claim on her. I am silent, said Poirot, his eyes twinkling a little, but all the same I say it is a pity. And now, messieurs, let us come to business. Both the other men looked at him in some surprise. You must not be shocked or alarmed at what I am about to say, supposing, Monsieur Van Alden, that, after all, Monsieur Derek Kettering did not murder his wife? What? Both men stared at him in blank surprise. Supposing, I say, that Monsieur Kettering did not murder his wife? Are you mad, Monsieur Poirot? It was Van Alden who spoke. No, said Poirot, I am not mad. I am eccentric, perhaps at least certain people say so, but as regards my profession, I am very much, as one says, all there. I ask you, Monsieur Van Alden, whether you would be glad or sorry if what I tell you should be the case? Van Alden stared at him. Naturally I should be glad, he said at last. Is this an exercise in suppositions, Monsieur Poirot, or are there any facts behind it? Poirot looked at the ceiling. There is an off chance, he said quietly, that it might be the Comte de la Roche after all. At least I have succeeded in upsetting his alibi. How did you manage that? Poirot shrugged his shoulders modestly. I have my own methods. The exercise of a little tact, a little cleverness, and the thing is done. But the rubies, said Van Alden, these rubies that the Count had in his possession were false. And clearly he would not have committed the crime except for the rubies. But you are overlooking one point, Monsieur Van Alden. Where the rubies were concerned, someone might have been before him. But this is an entirely new theory, cried Knighton. Do you really believe all this rigmarole, Monsieur Poirot? Demanded the millionaire. The thing is not proved, said Poirot quietly. It is as yet only a theory, but I tell you this, Monsieur Van Alden, the facts are worth investigating. You must come out with me to the south of France and go into the case on the spot. You really think this is necessary that I should go, I mean? I thought it would be what you yourself would wish, said Poirot. There was a hint of reproach in his tone which was not lost upon the other. Yes, yes, of course, he said. When do you wish to start, Monsieur Poirot? You are very busy at present, sir, murmured Knighton. But the millionaire had now made up his mind, and he waved the other's objections aside. I guess this business comes first, he said. All right, Monsieur Poirot, tomorrow. What train? We will go, I think, by the blue train, said Poirot, and he smiled. Chapter 34 The Blue Train Again. The millionaire's train, as it is sometimes called, swung round a curve of line at what seemed a dangerous speed. Van Alden, Knighton, and Poirot sat together in silence. Knighton and Van Alden had two compartments connecting with each other, as Ruth Kettering and her maid had had on the fateful journey. Poirot's own compartment was further along the coach. The journey was a painful one for Van Alden, recalling as it did the most agonizing memories. Poirot and Knighton conversed occasionally in low tones without disturbing him. When, however, the train had completed its slow journey round the ceinture and reached the Gare de Lyon, Poirot became suddenly galvanized into activity. Van Alden realized that part of his object in traveling by the train had been to attempt to reconstruct the crime. Poirot himself acted every part. He was in turn the maid, hurriedly shut into her own compartment, Mrs. Kettering, recognizing her husband with surprise and a trace of anxiety, and Derek Kettering discovering that his wife was traveling on the train. He tested various possibilities, such as the best way for a person to conceal himself in the second compartment. Then suddenly an idea seemed to strike him. He clutched at Van Alden's arm. Mon Dieu, but that is something I have not thought of. We must break our journey in Paris. Quick, quick, let us alight at once. Seizing suitcases he hurried from the train. Van Alden and Knighton, bewildered but obedient, followed him. Van Alden, having once formed his opinion of Poirot's ability, was slow to part from it. At the barrier they were held up. Their tickets were in charge of the conductor of the train, a fact which all three of them had forgotten. Poirot's explanations were rapid, fluent, and impassioned, but they produced no effect upon the stolid-faced official. Let us get quit of this, said Van Alden abruptly. I gather you are in a hurry, Monsieur Poirot. For God's sake, pay the fares from Calais and let us get right on with whatever you have got in your mind. But Poirot's flood of language had suddenly stopped dead, and he had the appearance of a man turned to stone. His arm, still outflung in an impassioned gesture, remained there as though stricken with paralysis. I have been an imbecile, he said simply. Ma foi, I lose my head nowadays. Let us return and continue our journey quietly. With reasonable luck the train will not have gone. They were only just in time, the train moving off as Knighton, the last of the three, swung himself and his suitcase on board. The conductor remonstrated with them feelingly, and assisted them to carry their luggage back to their compartments. Van Alden said nothing, but he was clearly disgusted at Poirot's extraordinary conduct. Alone with Knighton for a moment or two, he remarked, "This is a wild goose chase. The man has lost his grip on things. He has got brains up to a point, but any man who loses his head and scuttles round like a frightened rabbit is no earthly darned good." Poirot came to them in a moment or two, full of abject apologies and clearly so crestfallen that harsh words would have been superfluous. Van Alden received his apologies gravely, but managed to restrain himself from making acid comments. They had dinner on the train, and afterwards, somewhat to the surprise of the other two, Poirot suggested that they should all three set up in Van Alden's compartment. The millionaire looked at him curiously. "Is there anything that you are keeping back from us, Monsieur Poirot?" "I?" Poirot opened his eyes in innocent surprise. "But what an idea!" Van Alden did not answer, but he was not satisfied. The conductor was told that he need not make up the beds. Any surprise he might have felt was obliterated by the largeness of the tip which Van Alden handed to him. The three men sat in silence. Poirot fidgeted and seemed restless. Presently he turned to the secretary. "Major Knighton, is the door of your compartment bolted? The door into the corridor, I mean." "Yes, I bolted it myself just now." "Are you sure?" said Poirot. "I will go and make sure, if you like," said Knighton, smiling. "No, no, do not derange yourself. I will see for myself." He passed through the connecting door and returned in a second or two, nodding his head. "Yes, yes, it is as you said. You must pardon an old man's fussy ways." He closed the connecting door and resumed his place in the right-hand corner. The hours passed. The three men dozed fitfully, waking with uncomfortable starts. Probably never before had three people booked berths on the most luxurious train available, then declined to avail themselves of the accommodations they had paid for. Every now and then Poirot glanced at his watch, and then nodded his head and composed himself to slumber once more. On one occasion he rose from his seat and opened the connecting door, peered sharply into the adjoining compartment, and then returned to his seat, shaking his head. "What is the matter?" whispered Knighton. "You are expecting something to happen, aren't you?" "I have the nerves," confessed Poirot. "I am like the cat upon the hot tiles. Every little noise it makes me jump." Knighton yawned. "Of all the darned uncomfortable journeys," he murmured. "I suppose you know what you are playing at, Monsieur Poirot." He composed himself to sleep as best he could. Both he and Van Alden had succumbed to slumber, when Poirot, glancing for the 14th time at his watch, leant across and tapped the millionaire on the shoulder. "Eh? What is it?" "In 5 or 10 minutes, monsieur, we shall arrive at Lyons." "My God." Van Alden's face looked white and haggard in the dim light. "Then it must have been about this time that poor Ruth was killed." He sat staring straight in front of him. His lips twitched a little, his mind reverting back to the terrible tragedy that had saddened his life. There was the usual long screaming sigh of the brake, and the train slackened speed and drew into Lyons. Van Alden let down the window and leant out. "If it wasn't Derek, if your new theory is correct, it is here that the man left the train?" he asked over his shoulder. Rather to his surprise, Poirot shook his head. "No," he said thoughtfully, "no man left the train, but I think yes. I think a woman may have done so." Knighton gave a gasp. "A woman?" demanded Van Alden sharply. "Yes, a woman," said Poirot, nodding his head. "You may not remember, Monsieur Van Alden, but Miss Gray in her evidence mentioned that a youth in a cap and overcoat descended onto the platform ostensibly to stretch his legs. I think that youth was most probably a woman." "But who was she?" Van Alden's face expressed incredulity, but Poirot replied seriously and categorically. "Her name, or the name under which she was known, for many years is Kitty Kidd, but you, Monsieur Van Alden, knew her by another name, that of Ada Mason." Knighton sprang to his feet. "What?" he cried. Poirot swung round to him. "Ah! Before I forget it." He whipped something from a pocket and held it out. "Permit me to offer you a cigarette out of your own cigarette case. It was careless of you to drop it when you boarded the train on the Ceinture at Paris." Knighton stood staring at him as though stupefied. Then he made a movement, but Poirot flung up his hand in a warning gesture. "No, don't move," he said in a silky voice. "The door into the next compartment is open, and you are being covered from there this minute. I unbolted the door into the corridor when we left Paris, and our friends the police were told to take their places there. As I expect you know, the French police want you rather urgently, Major Knighton, or shall we say Monsieur le Marquis?" Chapter 35 Explanations. Explanations? Poirot smiled. He was sitting opposite the millionaire at a luncheon table in the latter's private suite at the Negresco. Facing him was a relieved but very puzzled man. Poirot leant back in his chair, lit one of his tiny cigarettes, and stared reflectively at the ceiling. "Yes, I will give you explanations. It began with the one point that puzzled me. You know what that point was? The disfigured face. It is not an uncommon thing to find when investigating a crime, and it rouses an immediate question, the question of identity. That naturally was the first thing that occurred to me. Was the dead woman really Mrs. Kettering? But that line led me nowhere, for Miss Gray's evidence was positive and very reliable, so I put that idea aside. The dead woman was Ruth Kettering. When did you first begin to suspect the maid? Not for some time, but one peculiar little point drew my attention to her. The cigarette case found in the railway carriage, and which she told us was one which Mrs. Kettering had given to her husband. Now that was, on the face of it, most improbable, seeing the terms that they were on. It awakened a doubt in my mind as to the general veracity of Ada Mason's statements. There was the rather suspicious fact to be taken into consideration that she had only been with her mistress for 2 months. Certainly it did not seem as if she could have had anything to do with the crime, since she had been left behind in Paris and Mrs. Kettering had been seen alive by several people afterwards, but Poirot leant forward. He raised an emphatic forefinger and wagged it with intense emphasis at Van Alden. But I am a good detective. I suspect. There is nobody and nothing that I do not suspect. I believe nothing that I am told. I say to myself, how do we know that Ada Mason was left behind in Paris? And at first the answer to that question seemed completely satisfactory. There was the evidence of your secretary, Major Knighton, a complete outsider whose testimony might be supposed to be entirely impartial, and there was the dead woman's own words to the conductor on the train. But I put the latter point aside for the moment, because a very curious idea, an idea perhaps fantastic and impossible, was growing up in my mind. If by any outside chance it happened to be true, that particular piece of testimony was worthless. I concentrated on the chief stumbling block to my theory, Major Knighton's statement that he saw Ada Mason at the Ritz after the blue train had left Paris. That seemed conclusive enough, but yet, on examining the facts carefully, I noted 2 things. First, that by a curious coincidence he, too, had been exactly 2 months in your service. Secondly, his initial letter was the same K. Just supposing that it was his cigarette case which had been found in the carriage. Then, if Ada Mason and he were working together, and she recognized it when we showed it to her, would she not act precisely as she had done? At first, taken aback, she quickly evolved a plausible theory that would agree with Mr. Kettering's guilt. Bien entendu, that was not the original idea. The Comte de la Roche was to be the scapegoat, though Ada Mason would not make her recognition of him too certain, in case he should be able to prove an alibi. Now, if you will cast your mind back to that time, you will remember a significant thing that happened. I suggested to Ada Mason that the man she had seen was not the Comte de la Roche, but Derek Kettering. She seemed uncertain at the time, but after I had got back to my hotel you rang me up and told me that she had come to you and said that, on thinking it over, she was now quite convinced that the man in question was Mr. Kettering. I had been expecting something of the kind. There could be but one explanation of this sudden certainty on her part. After my leaving your hotel, she had had time to consult with somebody, and had received instructions which she acted upon. Who had given her these instructions? Major Knighton. And there was another very small point, which might mean nothing or might mean a great deal. In casual conversation Knighton had talked of a jewel robbery in Yorkshire in a house where he was staying. Perhaps a mere coincidence, perhaps another small link in the chain. But there is one thing I do not understand, Monsieur Poirot. I guess I must be dense or I would have seen it before now. Who was the man in the train at Paris? Derek Kettering or the Comte de la Roche? That is the simplicity of the whole thing. There was no man. Ah, mille tonnerres! Do you not see the cleverness of it all? Whose word have we for it that there ever was a man there? Only Ada Mason's. And we believe in Ada Mason because of Knighton's evidence that she was left behind in Paris. But Ruth herself told the conductor that she had left her maid behind there, demurred Van Alden. Ah. I am coming to that. We have Mrs. Kettering's own evidence there, but, on the other hand, we have not really got her evidence, because, Monsieur Van Alden, a dead woman cannot give evidence. It is not her evidence, but the evidence of the conductor of the train, a very different affair altogether. So you think the man was lying? No, not at all. He spoke what he thought to be the truth. But the woman who told him that she had left her maid in Paris was not Mrs. Kettering. Van Alden stared at him. Monsieur Van Alden, Ruth Kettering was dead before the train arrived at the Gare de Lyon. It was Ada Mason, dressed in her mistress's very distinctive clothing, who purchased a dinner basket and who made that very necessary statement to the conductor. Impossible. No, no, Monsieur Van Alden, not impossible. Les femmes, they look so much alike nowadays that one identifies them more by their clothing than by their faces. Ada Mason was the same height as your daughter. Dressed in that very sumptuous fur coat and the little red lacquer hat jammed down over her eyes, with just a bunch of auburn curls showing over each ear, it was no wonder that the conductor was deceived. He had not previously spoken to Mrs. Kettering, you remember. True, he had seen the maid just for a moment when she handed him the tickets, but his impression had been merely that of a gaunt, black-clad female. If he had been an unusually intelligent man, he might have gone so far as to say that mistress and maid were not unlike, but it is extremely unlikely that he would even think that. And remember, Ada Mason, or Kitty Kidd, was an actress, able to change her appearance and tone of voice at a moment's notice. No, no, there was no danger of his recognizing the maid in the mistress's clothing, but there was the danger that when he came to discover the body he might realize it was not the woman he had talked to the night before. And now we see the reason for the disfigured face. The chief danger that Ada Mason ran was that Catherine Gray might visit her compartment after the train left Paris, and she provided against that difficulty by ordering a dinner basket and by locking herself in her compartment. But who killed Ruth and when? First, bear it in mind that the crime was planned and undertaken by the two of them, Knighton and Ada Mason, working together. Knighton was in Paris that day on your business. He boarded the train somewhere on its way round the Ceinture. Mrs. Kettering would be surprised, but she would be quite unsuspicious. Perhaps he draws her attention to something out the window, and as she turns to look he slips the cord round her neck and the whole thing is over in a second or two. The door of the compartment is locked, and he and Ada Mason set to work. They strip off the dead woman's outer clothes. Mason and Knighton roll the body up in a rug and put it on the seat in the adjoining compartment amongst the bags and suitcases. Knighton drops off the train, taking the jewel case containing the rubies with him. Since the crime is not supposed to have been committed until nearly 12 hours later, he is perfectly safe, and his evidence and the supposed Mrs. Kettering's words to the conductor will provide a perfect alibi for his accomplice. At the Gare de Lyon, Ada Mason gets a dinner basket, and shutting herself into the toilet compartment she quickly changes into her mistress's clothes, adjusts two false bunches of auburn curls, and generally makes up to resemble her as closely as possible. When the conductor comes to make up the bed, she tells him the prepared story about having left her maid behind in Paris, and whilst he is making up the berth, she stands looking out of the window, so that her back is towards the corridor and people passing along there. That was a wise precaution, because, as we know, Miss Gray was one of those passing, and she, among others, was willing to swear that Mrs. Kettering was still alive at that hour. "Go on," said Van Alden. Before getting to Lyons, Ada Mason arranged her mistress's body in the bunk, folded up the dead woman's clothes neatly on the end of it, and herself changed into a man's clothes and prepared to leave the train. When Derek Kettering entered his wife's compartment, and, as he thought, saw her asleep in her berth, the scene had been set, and Ada Mason was hidden in the next compartment waiting for the moment to leave the train unobserved. As soon as the conductor had swung himself down onto the platform at Lyons, she follows, slouching along as though just taking a breath of air. At a moment when she is unobserved, she hurriedly crosses to the other platform, and takes the first train back to Paris and the Ritz Hotel. Her name has been registered there as taking a room the night before by one of Knighton's female accomplices. She has nothing to do but wait there placidly for your arrival. The jewels are not, and never have been, in her possession. No suspicion attaches to him, and, as your secretary, he brings them to Nice without the least fear of discovery. Their delivery there to Monsieur Popopoulos is already arranged for, and they are entrusted to Mason at the last moment to hand over to the Greek. Altogether a very neatly planned coup, as one would expect from a master of the game such as the Marquis. And you honestly mean that Richard Knighton is a well-known criminal, who has been at this business for years? Poirot nodded. One of the chief assets of the gentleman called the Marquis was his plausible, ingratiating manner. You fell a victim to his charm, Monsieur Van Alden, when you engaged him as a secretary on such a slight acquaintanceship. I could have sworn that he never angled for the post, cried the millionaire. It was very astutely done, so astutely done that it deceived a man whose knowledge of other men is as great as yours is. I looked up his antecedents too. The fellow's record was excellent. Yes, that was part of the game. As Richard Knighton, his life was quite free from reproach. He was well born, well connected, did honorable service in the war, and seemed altogether above suspicion, but when I came to glean information about the mysterious Marquis, I found many points of similarity. Knighton spoke French like a Frenchman. He had been in America, France, and England at much the same time as the Marquis was operating. The Marquis was last heard of as engineering various jewel robberies in Switzerland, and it was in Switzerland that you had come across Major Knighton, and it was at precisely that time that the first rumors were going round of your being in treaty for the famous rubies. But why murder? Murmured Van Alden brokenly. Surely a clever thief could have stolen the jewels without running his head into a noose. Poirot shook his head. This is not the first murder that lies to the Marquis's charge. He is a killer by instinct. He believes, too, in leaving no evidence behind him. Dead men and women tell no tales. The Marquis had an intense passion for famous and historical jewels. He laid his plans far beforehand by installing himself as your secretary and getting his accomplice to obtain the situation of maid with your daughter, for whom he guessed the jewels were destined. And, though this was his matured and carefully thought-out plan, he did not scruple to attempt a shortcut by hiring a couple of Apaches to waylay you in Paris on the night you bought the jewels. That plan failed, which hardly surprised him, I think. This plan was, so he thought, completely safe. No possible suspicion could attach to Richard Knighton. But like all great men, the Marquis was a great man. He had his weaknesses. He fell genuinely in love with Miss Grey, and suspecting her liking for Derek Kettering, he could not resist the temptation to saddle him with the crime when the opportunity presented itself. And now, Monsieur Van Alden, I am going to tell you something very curious. Miss Grey is not a fanciful woman by any means, yet she firmly believes that she felt your daughter's presence beside her one day in the casino gardens at Monte Carlo, just after she had been having a long talk with Knighton. She was convinced, she says, that the dead woman was urgently trying to tell her something, and it suddenly came to her that what the dead woman was trying to say was that Knighton was her murderer. The idea seemed so fantastic at the time that Miss Grey spoke of it to no one. But she was so convinced of its truth that she acted on it, wild as it seemed. She did not discourage Knighton's advances, and she pretended to him that she was convinced of Derek Kettering's guilt. Extraordinary, said Van Alden. Yes, it is very strange. One cannot explain these things. Oh, by the way, there is one little point that baffled me considerably. Your secretary has a decided limp, the result of a wound that he received in the war. Now the Marquis most decidedly did not limp. That was a stumbling block. But Miss Lennox Tamplin happened to mention one day that Knighton's limp had been a surprise to the surgeons who had been in charge of the case in her mother's hospital. That suggested camouflage. When I was in London, I went to the surgeon in question, and I got several technical details from him which confirmed me in that belief. I mentioned the name of that surgeon in Knighton's hearing the day before yesterday. The natural thing would have been for Knighton to mention that he had been attended by him during the war, but he said nothing, and that little point, if nothing else, gave me the last final assurance that my theory of the crime was correct. Miss Grey, too, provided me with a cutting, showing that there had been a robbery at Lady Tamplin's hospital during the time that Knighton had been there. She realized that I was on the same track as herself when I wrote to her from the Ritz in Paris. I had some trouble in my inquiries there, but I got what I wanted: evidence that Ada Mason arrived on the morning after the crime and not on the evening of the day before. There was a long silence, then the millionaire stretched out a hand to Poirot across the table. I guess you know what this means to me, Monsieur Poirot, he said huskily. I am sending you round a cheque in the morning, but no cheque in the world will express what I feel about what you have done for me. You are the goods, Monsieur Poirot. Every time, you are the goods. Poirot rose to his feet, his chest swelled. I am only Hercule Poirot, he said modestly, yet, as you say, in my own way I am a big man, even as you also are a big man. I am glad and happy to have been of service to you. Now I go to repair the damages caused by travel. Alas! My excellent Georges is not with me. In the lounge of the hotel he encountered a friend, the venerable Monsieur Popopoulos, his daughter Zia beside him. I thought you had left Nice, Monsieur Poirot, murmured the Greek as he took the detective's affectionately proffered hand. Business compelled me to return, my dear Monsieur Popopoulos. Business? Yes, business. And talking of business, I hope your health is better, my dear friend? Much better. In fact, we are returning to Paris tomorrow. I am enchanted to hear such good news. You have not completely ruined the Greek ex-minister, I hope. I understand you sold him a very wonderful ruby which strictly Entre nous is being worn by Mademoiselle Mirelle, the dancer. Yes, murmured Monsieur Popopoulos, yes, that is so. A ruby not unlike the famous heart of fire. It has points of resemblance, certainly, said the Greek casually. You have a wonderful hand with jewels, Monsieur Popopoulos. I congratulate you. Mademoiselle Zia, I am desolate that you are returning to Paris so speedily. I had hoped to see some more of you now that my business is accomplished. Would one be indiscreet if one asked what that business was? Asked Monsieur Popopoulos. Not at all, not at all. I have just succeeded in laying the Marquis by the heels. A faraway look came over Monsieur Popopoulos' noble countenance. The Marquis? He murmured, now why does that seem familiar to me? No, I cannot recall it. You would not, I am sure, said Poirot. I refer to a very notable criminal and jewel robber. He has just been arrested for the murder of the English lady, Madame Kettering. Indeed? How interesting these things are. A polite exchange of farewells followed, and when Poirot was out of earshot, Monsieur Popopoulos turned to his daughter. Zia, he said, with feeling, that man is the devil. I like him. I like him myself, admitted Monsieur Popopoulos. But he is the devil, all the same. Chapter 36 By the Sea. The mimosa was nearly over. The scent of it in the air was faintly unpleasant. There were pink geraniums twining along the balustrade of Lady Tamplin's villa, and masses of carnations below sent up a sweet, heavy perfume. The Mediterranean was at its bluest. Poirot sat on the terrace with Lennox Tamplin. He had just finished telling her the same story he had told to Van Alden 2 days before. Lennox had listened to him with absorbed attention, her brows knitted and her eyes somber. When he had finished she said simply, "And Derek? He was released yesterday. And he has gone where? He left Nice last night. For Street Mary Mead." "Yes, for Street Mary Mead." There was a pause. "I was wrong about Catherine," said Lennox. "I thought she did not care. She is very reserved. She trusts no one." "She might have trusted me," said Lennox, with a shade of bitterness. "Yes," said Poirot gravely, "she might have trusted you. But Mademoiselle Catherine has spent a great deal of her life listening, and those who have listened do not find it easy to talk, they keep their sorrows and joys to themselves and tell no one." "I was a fool," said Lennox, "I thought she really cared for Knighton. I ought to have known better. I suppose I thought so because, well, I hoped so." Poirot took her hand and gave it a little friendly squeeze. "Courage, mademoiselle," he said gently. Lennox looked very straight out across the sea, and her face, in its ugly rigidity, had for the moment a tragic beauty. "Oh, well," she said at last, "it would not have done. I am too young for Derek, he is like a kid that has never grown up. He wants the Madonna touch." There was a long silence, then Lennox turned to him quickly and impulsively. "But I did help, Monsieur Poirot, at any rate I did help." "Yes, mademoiselle. It was you who gave me the first inkling of the truth when you said that the person who committed the crime need not have been on the train at all. Before that, I could not see how the thing had been done. Lennox drew a deep breath. I am glad, she said, at any rate that is something. From far behind them there came a long drawn-out scream of an engine's whistle. That is that damned blue train, said Lennox. Trains are relentless things, aren't they, Monsieur Poirot? People are murdered and die, but they go on just the same. I am talking nonsense, but you know what I mean. Yes, I know. Life is like a train, mademoiselle. It goes on. And it is a good thing that that is so. Why? Because the train gets to its journey's end at last, and there is a proverb about that in your language, mademoiselle. Journeys end in lovers' meeting. Lennox laughed. That is not going to be true for me. Yes, it is true. You are young, younger than you yourself know. Trust the train, mademoiselle, for it is le bon Dieu who drives it. The whistle of the engine came again. Trust the train, mademoiselle, murmured Poirot again. And trust Hercule Poirot. He knows. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.